So hi everybody, my name is Citali Rivas. I am a fourth year biology major. My faculty mentor is Dr. Xochitl Chavez, who is in the Department of Music. And my presentation is entitled COVID-19 Performing Arts, Rehearsal Structure, Interpersonal Relationships, and Performance. So I do want to preface a little bit that my research paper is very, very long and all the information cannot be presented in a 15-minute presentation. So this presentation will just be focused on my findings. So I apologize if everything seems a little bit rushed. So a little bit of motivation behind my project. I am a performing arts kid. I started when I was a little girl. And then when we started rehearsing online, I noticed that we had a lot of difficulties and challenges with rehearsing virtually. And then I went to another performing arts group's rehearsal and I noticed that they were having the same challenges. So that's what provoked me to present this idea to Dr. Chavez to see if all performing arts groups are undergoing these challenges and if these challenges will still remain once we transition back to rehearsing in person. So what am I researching? I looked at 4 different things. I wanted to investigate the challenges of virtual rehearsals. I wanted to look at the effects of virtual rehearsals on rehearsal structure, interpersonal relationships, and performances. And I wanted to investigate the differences and challenges between in-person rehearsals before and after quarantine. And lastly, I wanted to look at the effects of transitioning back to in-person rehearsals on rehearsal structure, interpersonal relationships, and performances. So the way I collected my data was through ethnographic semi-structured interviews. So I recruited my participants. We did our first interview, which was based on their experience of rehearsing virtually. And then I made the transcript for those interviews. I then did a second interview with them, which was about their experience of transitioning back to in-person rehearsals. But at this time, I also did observational field work. I went to different rehearsals and to different performances, and I did both naturalistic observations. And since I am a musician, I did participant observations as well. And then after all of that, I made the transcripts for the second interview. So my participants were from 3 different performing arts groups. The first ones were instrumentalists, then I had vocalists, and then I had dancers. I had a total of 10 participants in my study. Only 9 are listed here. The 10th participant was a sound engineer that worked with the musicians for their digital recordings for their Zoom performances. And I do want to point out that the dancers are a student-led group on campus, while the instrumentalists and the vocalists are faculty-led groups on campus. So what did I find? So within the my first interview that focused on virtual rehearsals, I looked at 11 different aspects. So the first one was why performers continued rehearsing virtually. And here, a lot of the participants said to maintain some sort of normalcy that they had before the pandemic and to have a community when everybody was isolated in their homes. I then looked at the effects of virtual rehearsals on rehearsal structure, and I found that the instructors try to maintain a lot of the components that were in in-person rehearsals prior to the pandemic. This refers to the order and way things were done. But the biggest change that I noticed was that there was an emphasis of more work in smaller groups and breakout rooms. That's because Zoom isn't really designed for performing arts. Only one person can talk at a time, and no one really had, it can't really pick up instrument sound or people singing. So that's why they kind of focused on smaller groups to kind of reap the most benefits of rehearsing on a digital platform. And there's also a lag as well. So that's why nobody could like play or dance together at the same time. I then looked at the effects of virtual rehearsals on rehearsal atmosphere, and I noticed that the results here were kind of split. Some participants said that it was an enjoyable experience, while others said it felt very different. There was a disconnection and sometimes a lack of energy, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. And then I looked at the effects of virtual rehearsals on interpersonal relationships. And I noticed that there were really no issues with welcoming new members and forming relationships. However, they remained stagnant. There was really no growth, but at the same time, they really didn't diminish. And here is why. This is what a typical Zoom rehearsal looks like. I took these last year while we were rehearsing virtually. As you can see in the main breakout room where everybody is together, not a lot of cameras are on, everybody's muted. There's not really a lot of interaction. It's mainly only the instructor that's talking. While if you look at the breakout rooms, more cameras are on, less people are muted, there's more interactions. So I feel like that's why performers said that the atmosphere was very different and weird because there was no interaction, but at the same time in the smaller rooms, there were. And I feel like that's why the relationships didn't really grow, because there were moments where you could socialize and moments where you can't, whereas in person, you could practically socialize the entire time. I then looked at the greatest challenges of virtual rehearsals, and the most common answer, besides technological and connectivity issues, was that nobody was able to see and hear each other in real time. And then another challenge was finding motivation to continue. Obviously, if you can't really see or hear anybody and there's really no interaction, it could be kind of hard to find that motivation to continue rehearsing and to continue working on the projects that you're doing for that quarter. I know I felt that a lot when I was rehearsing virtually. I then asked how the performers felt when they were rehearsing virtually alone. And the reason why I referred to them rehearsing alone is because they no longer had their instructor in front of them to provide real-time feedback. So now they were trying to critique themselves, correct themselves, better themselves all on their own, instead of having the instructor to physically show them the technique or to like physically correct them. So a lot of students said that they felt overwhelmed doing all of this and frustrated, while some really liked working independently. I then looked at the effects of virtual rehearsals on performances. Unfortunately, not everybody was able to have virtual performances. The dancers didn't, but the instrumentalists and the vocalists did. Once again, the dancers are a student-led group, and they didn't really have the same amount of resources that a faculty-led group does. So when you have a faculty-led mentor, faculty members usually know other faculty members, and they can have, they could talk to each other and kind of give resources to show them how to record and how to have virtual performances. Whereas student-led groups, they don't have that easy access. So now they have to find that on their own, which makes finding the resources to perform virtually a little bit more challenging. But those who did have performances, it consisted of pre-recorded videos and audios that they would do on their own, and then they would submit them, and then the sound engineer would come in, mix and master it, and combine all those components into one that they would then showcase on Zoom for their audience to see. I then asked them what recording from home was like, and students said that this was a new skill that they had to learn, and they had to get that recording studio level sound from home, and they were given resources on how to do that. But the greatest challenge in this was finding long periods of time to record. Obviously, college students typically don't live on their own. They live with family, they live with roommates. So it was hard to like work around their schedules and to find that solid time, quiet time to record. I then looked at the effects of virtual rehearsals on performer progress, and this is where my findings get a little interesting because the students said that their performer progress was negatively affected, while the instructor said that theirs was positively affected. And I feel like this is because as an instructor, you had to find creative ways to keep these rehearsals engaging and beneficial to the performer, as well as students, they're losing those skills that you need to have in in-person rehearsals to make those successful. So they were no longer practicing listening to each other across the room. They were no longer practicing using their peripheral vision to make sure that they're in line and dancing on time. So they were losing those skills while instructors were gaining skills. I then asked if they had any suggestions to make these virtual rehearsals better. And one said to have unified administrative guidelines that tell performing arts groups how to run virtual rehearsals. Obviously, we were all kind of thrown into this. We were in person one day and then virtual the next. So it was obviously chaotic, but now knowing what we know now and seeing what worked and what didn't, the performing arts sector could all come together and come together to create guidelines, not only for faculty-led groups, but for student-led groups as well. So that way they have access to all the resources that faculty-led groups did so that they could perform virtually. Another student mentioned to have a platform where everybody can see and hear each other in real time. Another student mentioned to have kind of like a mentor system or a check-in buddy. Not only will this help foster growth of interpersonal relationships, but it'll also do kind of like a mental health check-in to make sure everybody's doing okay. And then lastly, this was suggested by one of the dancers, but to have everything pre-recorded and to use multiple camera angles. On Zoom, when you're trying to learn dance movements, there's a lag. So the music doesn't match up with the choreography. So therefore it looks out of time. If you use the pre-recorded route, the dancers can see how the music matches up with the steps. And with using different camera angles, they can see how exactly their body's supposed to look when they're dancing. The last question I asked them is if performers would do virtual rehearsals again, and Unsurprisingly, everybody said no. And I feel like this is my most significant finding because it shows that virtual rehearsals are not sustainable. Yes, it's better than not rehearsing at all for the past year and a half, but there needs to be a push back to in-person rehearsals in order for it to be the most, that's because that is the most beneficial thing for performers. So speaking of transitioning back to in-person rehearsals, for the second interview, I looked at 9 different aspects. So I looked at the effects of transitioning back to in-person on rehearsal structure. And once again, like I didn't really notice a difference from in-person now to in-person before the pandemic. Everything was basically done in the same order. The biggest difference though was there was an emphasis on basics. So as I mentioned that performing arts students were losing specific skills, they returned to those skills. So there's an emphasis of how to listen to each other, how to watch each other, how to do proper technique, all of that stuff. And another interesting thing that I noticed is that the dancers had a hybrid option. So they would have their in-person component and then they would have a Zoom component for those who don't feel safe to return in person, or if they just couldn't make it if they were not feeling well. I then asked what the effects of the transition back to being in person was on the rehearsal atmosphere. And this is very different from the responses that I got from the virtual rehearsal findings. All the participants said that the rehearsal atmosphere was now enjoyable and that they were excited to be rehearsing in person, whereas before it was split. Some found it enjoyable while some didn't. I then looked at the effects of the transition back on interpersonal relationships, and I saw that relationships were strengthened. Obviously, because you're in person, it's easier to interact. You could see each other, hear each other, and it just makes it so much easier to socialize. I noticed there's a lot of socialization before rehearsals, after rehearsals, and even during rehearsals when instructors were working with other students, and they could finally put names to faces. So overall, the relationships grew during this transitional time. I then asked if the transition was back, if the transition back was harder than an in-person rehearsal prior to the pandemic. And basically everybody said yes, just because they had to relearn how to rehearse as a group. And I know I found it difficult because I noticed that I wasn't really looking up at the conductor anymore. And that's something you need to do when you're in person, but that's not something we did for the past year and a half while we were recording from home. And then there was also a challenge with hybrid rehearsals. With the dancers, I noticed that the camera was often forgotten. So if they moved to one part of the room, they didn't take the computer with them. So the members that were on the Zoom call were often left out of whatever the group was learning at that moment in time. And then also the way that the camera was positioned, the steps were mirrored. So the instructor's right was my left. And so I would be learning the steps incorrectly. So as a member, like that would be kind of frustrating thinking you learned it and then you go back in person and it's like you have to relearn it. I then asked what the safety precautions used for COVID-19 were, and all of them followed the university's guidelines. Everybody wore masks, they social distanced, they had ventilation methods, and they rehearsed outside. The instrumentalists, since they're able to spread aerosols in multiple ways, they had more precautions. So they utilized bell covers, the brass instruments had bags or pads to catch their spit, and then they also did weekly testing. These are just some examples of the rehearsal spaces that I saw. As you can see, most of them are outside, or they have a lot of ventilation. And even if they're inside, the room is big enough for them to socially distance properly. Here are some more safety precautions. Those are the fans, the air ventilators that help circulate the air. And then these are the little bags that I was talking about for the brass instruments. They each have the name and it corresponds to the performer. So everybody had their own. I then asked what rehearsing with the mask was like, and it is very unenjoyable. It's hard to breathe, it's hard to catch your breath. You don't have full range of motion of your mouth anymore, so it's hard to play your instrument, and it's hard to hear people talking. It was, for me personally, it was very annoying, and I agree with all of my participants. I then asked what outdoor rehearsals were like. They said it wasn't the best option when the weather isn't ideal because it's windy, it could be cold, rainy, hot, all that stuff. Certainly better than rehearsing virtually, but it's not as efficient as rehearsing in a rehearsal hall. I then asked what the effects on the transition back on performances were. And the good news is that everybody was able to perform, but it was usually different than what they usually did. So the instrumentalists, they still performed on Zoom, but instead of doing individual recordings, they all recorded together on stage and then submitted that on Zoom for the audience to see. And then everybody else performed outdoors, which I thought was super cool because that attracts a different audience than you would usually get in the theater. You get people who normally don't go to performing arts performances. So I thought that was really cool. My last question that I asked them was suggestions on how to make this transition better. Students offered no suggestions. They said there was no easier way to do this. You just have to push through and get used to rehearsing in person again. Well, instructors suggested to start off slow, be understanding, and be flexible, as everybody's abilities are different now than when they were prior to the pandemic. So in conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted basically every aspect of performers' rehearsals. There can be improvements to make virtual rehearsals and the transition back to in-person better. However, nothing will ever replace the efficiency of in-person rehearsals prior to the pandemic and without any COVID-19 restrictions. Being in person in close proximities is essential for performers to have productive rehearsals, form friendships, and to have performances. So thank you everybody so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Citali. That was really wonderful. I agree, all of us had to